Dear participants, good afternoon. Please take your seats. We are about to begin in 2-3 minutes. So good afternoon again, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you all at MGIMO University. I would like to especially thank not those studying or working here, but those who showed interest, registered, and came to hear us talk and debate. I'm sure you'll enjoy that, or I hope so at least. My name is Andrei Baikov. I'm Vice Rector of this university in charge of international partnerships, so it's quite pertinent that I'm opening this conference, but also because I've been personally involved in initiating, designing, and expanding this MGIMO Fletcher cooperation, and I'm very pleased to see you all here. And I'm proud to tell you that this is our third joint conference that we've held. We had one in Boston, we had one about a year ago at MGIMO, and we also had over the 3 years that we've been implementing this initiative, 2 studies module. This one is the second one, whereby students from both Fletcher and MGIMO come together and work jointly on very acute issues that are both countries facing, and they're looking for joint solutions. And what is even more interesting, they can have some practical high-level policy feedback to their proposals, because last year and this year it will repeat itself. Last year they presented their findings to the head of the North America Department of the Foreign Ministry and to the American Ambassador John Huntsman. This year they're going to present it to the American Ambassador John Huntsman, but also to the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, so they can get some real practical feedback to their ideas, maybe sometimes a bit too theoretical, sometimes a bit too bold, but at the same time they can have it not just in a purely academic realm, but also practical. I can also say that we see some very tangible results that this partnership is yielding. Just last September, when I came to Washington for an annual meeting of deans and directors of diplomatic academies from all over the world, at the reception at the State Department, I was approached by a student who turned out to be a member of the American Fletcher delegation, who came to MGIMO for the last year's studies module, and she is now employed by the State Department, working there, recognizing me and saying all sorts of positive things about that experience. I think she was one of the 2 of that year's class employed by the State Department, so we are actually contributing to preparing that new generation of decision makers and people who are practically involved in foreign policies of their 2 respective countries, and we can see a clear measure of that. I can assure you that from that class of MGIMO students, more than 1 or 2 actually became members of the Russian Foreign Affairs staff. As you know, MGIMO is the main feed institution for the Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry. So I hope we are not just debating here theoretically and not trying to imitate the practical feel that it all has, but we're actually training future diplomats, which is great to realize. I would like to use this session as a welcoming session to acknowledge the contribution of those who've made this gathering possible. And this is, first of all, my co-convener and professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Dan Dresner, who's going to speak the first. Then I would like to pass the floor to Georgy Borisenko, who is the director of the North American Department at the Foreign Affairs Ministry of the Russian Federation. Then I will pass the floor to Thomas Leary, Minister Counsel at the American Embassy here in Moscow, who's also, together with his colleagues, been extremely instrumental in promoting this cooperation, helping us with all sorts of logistical stuff, in materializing the agreement on student exchange. And finally, I would like then to invite to speak Mr. Roman Grishenin. He's Deputy Executive Director of the Alexander Gorchakov Public Diplomacy Fund, and I here must acknowledge the contribution of this fund, along with the Carnegie Corporation, who are the main two sponsors of this conference, of the studies module, but also of the whole program, if we talk about the Carnegie Corporation, of our Fletcher MGIMO partnership. So here I end, finally, and I give the floor to Dan Dresner for his initial welcoming remarks. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Dean Bykov. And again, please repeat what Andrei said. My thanks both to my partner, Dean Bykov, the rector, Torkunov, as well as the funders, the Gorshkov Foundation, as well as the Carnegie Corporation. I am also glad to be back here for the second conference. I'm also glad that I think we learned from the first year's worth of conferences a great deal. We learned a lot about the sort of substantive areas of possible agreement and obvious disagreement between our two countries. But I think far more important than that, we learned a very valuable lesson, which is to not have conference days that last longer than 5 hours. We made the mistake last year of having a conference at twice. And to be fair, let me, as an American, make the first gesture of apology. It was my first misstep because the first conference was in Medford. We, for a variety of logistical reasons, had the entire conference in one day, which I believe started at 8 in the morning and ended at 8 in the evening. And that was a mistake, and I apologize to everyone who had participated in that, even though we did learn a great deal. And then, of course, we had a similar experience here. So we're doing this in a much more civilized fashion this time, which I think will hopefully lead to even better interactions. And I'm also pleased to see this is also the first time we've done these conferences to coincide with student interactions as well. And so it's a pleasure to see several of my Fletcher students, not mine personally, but in a collective sense, in the audience. And indeed, I think one of the major successes you can argue with respect to the program is the degree to which there's been considerable enthusiasm within the Fletcher School for participating in these sorts of interactions, which frankly 2 years ago did not exist. And so, and the fact that Professor Miller, along in terms of his course with Professor Istomin, has to turn away Fletcher students from taking it is also a sign, I think, of the strong interest. I'll also extend greetings from our dean, our interim dean, Ian Johnstone. He sends his apologies for not being able to attend. Unfortunately, being even interim dean of the Fletcher School means that your schedules change at the last minute and you are constrained in terms of being able to come to Moscow. We are hopeful that when we select a new dean, that dean will be able to participate more actively. And I will, just close with 2 points because I don't have much to say at this point. The first is that given the nature of the bilateral relationship, which I believe we're going to discuss more in the next panel, it just sort of highlights the vital nature of this kind of partnership. It is precisely when relations between two countries are on the downturn that you want to make sure that you have some kind of consistent channel of people moving back and forth. And indeed, in some ways, in my experience dealing with the Fletcher faculty, the students are much better at this. But with Fletcher faculty, a key thing for them is comfort. They like being comfortable, and the idea for some of them of going to Russia, even a few years ago, would have been an alien concept to them. And so I think the idea that this is now a normal and routine part of what Fletcher School faculty should do is a promising thing, and hopefully one that helps to instill greater cooperation. And I will just close by saying that I am extremely looking very much forward to conversations going forward, not just with faculty, with students. Indeed, on the drive-in when I came in from the airport, I got into a very fascinating conversation about the state of IR theory, which, given my jet lag, should not have happened. I should have fallen asleep, but I was extremely stimulated by that conversation, so it's definitely shaped my enthusiasm for the rest of the week. And with that, I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Ambassador Borisenko. You can speak from here if you want.
Thank you. Dear friends, let me start by expressing my gratitude for the invitation to this respectable conference on the current state of Russia-US relations. Regular joint events organized by two alma maters of diplomats, MGIMO University of Russia and Austin Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy of the United States, have already become a good tradition. You may be assured that these initiatives will receive continued support from the Foreign Ministry of Russia. Turning to the point of today's discussion, the truth is that unfortunately there hasn't been any progress in Russia-US relations. The dialogue continues to be overshadowed and largely paralyzed by anti-Russia hysteria that has gripped some in the political establishment in Washington, D.C. The vision to contain Russia has been fixed in the national security strategy of the United States and even codified in the U.S. legislation by the country and America's adversaries through Sanctions Act adopted in 2017. While claiming that it strives for normal cooperation, the current U.S. administration acts inconsistently. It seeks contacts at different levels and then cancels them. For example, this was the case with the meeting between presidents on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Buenos Aires on November 30th. The planned meeting got derailed at the last moment under the pretext of the Ukrainian provocation in the Black Sea. The position of our American colleagues brought to a halt the implementation of most of the agreements reached at the bilateral summit in Helsinki on July 16 last year. Specifically, Washington hampers the establishment of the Business Advisory Council composed of businessmen from Russia and the United States and expert council of prominent non-governmental analysts, evades the setting up a joint working group on cybersecurity, as discussed by the heads of state back at their first meeting in Hamburg in 2017. In the meantime, unfriendly acts against our country continue. Economic pressure is being built up. Unilateral sanctions of the United States against Russia have already been expanded 76 times since 2011, including last Friday. This number alone attests to their ineffectiveness. For every new round of sanctions means that the previous ones did not work. However, some politicians in Washington are still under the illusion that Russia can be forced into putting aside its national interests in giving up its independent policy. Absolutely absurd is the stamping of anti-Russian measures on the ground of the staged assassination attempt on Sergei and Yulia Skripal in the United Kingdom last year. We are accused of the alleged poisoning, although no one has seen the so-called victims. Nonetheless, already 1 year ago, at the very beginning of this story, the US authorities expelled 60 Russian diplomats and shut down Russia's consulate general in Seattle. We had to reciprocate, so nobody won. Then Washington got to threatening to wind down bilateral trade altogether and scale down diplomatic relationship. Such step will damage both sides even more. American actions have jeopardized important agreements in the area of strategic stability. On February 2, the United States officially notified us of the suspension of its participation in the INF Treaty and subsequent withdrawal from it in 6 months. In other words, on August 2nd, this agreement will cease to exist. It was a long-time desire of Washington to dismantle this treaty. To that end, Russia was deliberately accused of its violation. However, no proof, let me stress that absolutely no tangible proof has been provided. Meanwhile, our counterclaims and suggestions how to resolve mutual concerns have been ignored. What I am talking about is not a sole example of an irresponsible behavior, but rather a deliberate line taken by Washington in order to get rid of any restrictions in the military field. In general, there is a decline in the level of responsible attitude in the United States towards such important matters as arms control, particularly for nuclear weapons and missiles. For our part, clearly we cannot ignore new threats brought about by the derailment of the INF Treaty. It will be the same way as earlier we had to react to the deployment of the American anti-missile defense system around our territory. We will respond to all unfriendly acts, take essential protective measures, but I would like to reiterate, our actions are purely reactive. We did not choose them. Despite the sad reality, we keep a window of opportunity open for the improvement of relations, establishment of a constructive dialogue with the United States on the broadest range of bilateral and international issues. Russia's President Vladimir Putin stated that on many occasions, we strongly believe that it is in the mutual interests of our countries to build a predictable model of cooperation based on mutual respect and non-interference in the internal affairs of each other. In certain areas, working-level communication is progressing quite well. For example, there is a regular exchange of views on the situation in Syria, Afghanistan, on the Korean Peninsula. After the Helsinki summit, we succeeded in restarting a counter-terrorism dialogue terminated by Barack Obama. Despite sanctions, representatives of business community are also finding ways to cooperate. Bilateral trade fell to $20 billion by the end of Obama's presidential term, but has started to recover over the last 2 years, reaching $25 billion. American business is welcome in Russia that seeks to ensure a favorable environment for it. We believe that it is also important to foster people-to-people contacts. However, it is very difficult now to obtain American visas in Russia. In Moscow, wait time for visa appointments is 300 days, 10 months. It looks so that for some reason the US authorities do not want Russian people to visit the United States. On the contrary, we are willing to have more Americans traveling to Russia. We were pleased to see many fans from the United States, over 80,000, attending FIFA World Cup in Russia last year. A major problem in the current Russia-US relations is a deficit of trust due to lack of mutual understanding. Intensification of human ties is an effective way to overcome this barrier. The more diverse and close contacts between people of Russia and the United States are, including between scholars and universities, the less there will be reasons for suspicion. It will be also easier to strike a positive note in the interstate dialogue. That is exactly the goal of joint conferences of MGIMO University and the Fletcher School. We are truly grateful to the organizers for such useful initiative. Life dictates us to be realists and stand ready for different scenarios. Nevertheless, it is our hope that with time we will be able to bring our bilateral ties back on a more stable track. We hope that they will no longer be poisoned by factors of America's domestic politics. In order to forge normal, stable relations, it is necessary to cooperate in the spirit of taking into account national interests that both the United States and Russia have. Ideas and recommendations of the expert community on the ways to ensure that are of great practical value. On behalf of the Foreign Ministry of Russia, I wish participants of the conference informative discussion and fruitful joint work in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Borisenko. I would now like to give the floor to Thomas Leary, Minister Counsel of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow.
Thanks, Andre. Good afternoon. I am honored to be with you today at the opening of this МГИМО Fletcher Conference on challenges in Russian-American relations. There are obviously no lack of such challenges. I have no doubt that the specialists from these two great institutions dedicated to the study of foreign policy will examine these challenges in a thoughtful and balanced manner and propose ways of addressing them. I would like to thank Andrei Bykov, Daniel Dresner, and their many colleagues at МГИМО in the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy who have made this conference possible. I am pleased to be joining them along with my Ministry of Foreign Affairs colleague Georgy Borisenko and Roman Grishinin from the Gorshakov Foundation in delivering these welcome remarks. I want to say just a few words about the topics that we will address shortly in the plenary session: how domestic political processes affect U.S.-Russian relations, the state of nuclear arms control agreements, and the role that regional security issues play in our relations. Let me start with domestic politics, and I'll only talk about American domestic politics, naturally. There is, of course, ongoing debate in the United States about the nature and extent of Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, but not the fact of Russian interference. Director of National Intelligence Coates addressed this unequivocally when he said, "We have been clear in our assessments of Russian meddling in the 2016 elections and their ongoing, pervasive efforts to undermine our democracy." A large majority of Americans agree with our intelligence community's assessment. According to an August 2018 Gallup poll, 75% of Americans believe that Russia interfered in the 2016 presidential elections, as opposed to just 16% who do not believe that. This large majority of Americans that is convinced that Russia interfered in our elections diverges only on whether or not they believe that this interference affected the result. Americans' opinions of Russia remain at a nearly historical low. Just 21% of Americans have a favorable view of Russia, according to Pew Research Center polling released just 2 weeks ago. Even fewer Democrats view Russia favorably, just 16%. Without a doubt, public opinion exerts an influence on U.S.-Russian relations. My academic colleagues here are better equipped to assess how exactly, but I think it's worth underscoring one point before the plenary session. The partisan debate in the United States about the nature and implications of Russian interference in our 2016 presidential election is not the principal reason why Americans' opinion of Russia is at a nearly historical low, as some have claimed. I would argue that Russian foreign policy is responsible for that. In 2014, in the wake of the annexation of Crimea and Russian intervention in Ukraine, the percentage of Americans with a favorable view of Russia fell to just 19%, according to Pew Research Center polling. I'd like to turn briefly to the state of nuclear arms control agreements between our countries by describing my government's position. For 6 years, both the Trump and Obama administration raised concerns about Russia's non-compliance with the INF Treaty. In December, the Trump administration informed Russia's government that the U.S. would withdraw from the treaty if Russia did not come into compliance. That did not happen, and on February 2nd, the U.S. began the process of withdrawing from the treaty. Secretary of State Pompeo very clearly stated our rationale for suspending our obligations under the treaty when he said, quote, "The United States has gone to tremendous lengths to preserve the INF Treaty, engaging with Russian officials more than 30 times over nearly 6 years to discuss Russia's violation, including at the highest levels of government. Despite our efforts, Russia continues to deny that its non-compliant missile system, the SSC-8 or 9M729, violates the treaty. The United States takes its treaty obligations seriously and will not stand idle when others flout their obligations. Violations of treaty obligations must have consequences. The United States remains committed to effective arms control that advances U.S. allied and partner security, is verifiable and enforceable, and includes partners that comply responsibly with their obligations." End quote. Let me turn now to the final issue to be addressed at the plenary session: regional security issues and their impact on U.S.-Russian relations. We maintain channels of communication with Russia on Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan, and North Korea. These have been productive to varying degrees. From the beginning of the crisis, the United States and the European Union have stood united in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated its commitment to the Minsk agreements. In contrast, Russia hasn't even started to fulfill its commitment to improve the security situation in eastern Ukraine. Concerning Syria, Secretary Pompeo has underscored our strong support for the UN's efforts to reinvigorate efforts towards a political solution that will involve all Syrians, include constitutional reform, and meet the need for credible preparations for free and fair elections. We have grave concerns about the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons. On the positive side, Russian and American forces in Syria have developed an effective deconfliction channel to avoid misunderstandings as they conduct operations. On North Korea, we have begun a cooperative dialogue. Our special envoy for North Korea, Mark Lambert, met with Russian officials on March 4th to discuss the Hanoi summit and how we might advance efforts to achieve a fully denuclearized North Korea. U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation, Khalilzad, has consulted with his Russian counterparts, most recently in Ankara at the end of last month, as part of our ongoing efforts to support Afghans in finding a political solution. Conferences like this one, and the broader ties between MGIMO and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, illustrate the value of people-to-people ties. Especially in times like the current one, it is essential that we support our citizens' mutual interest in one another's countries, respect for one another's cultures, and desire for dialogue. I hope that your discussions are productive, and I hope that the ties between these two great universities dedicated to the study of international relations endure and prosper. Thank you very much.
I would now like to pass the floor to Roman Grushenin. He's Deputy Executive Director of the Alexander Gorchakov Public Diplomacy Fund.
I'm really thrilled to have an opportunity to welcome you on behalf of the Gorchakov Fund and its head of Board of Trustees, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov. And now a few words in Russian, if it's possible. Мы, будучи достаточно взрослыми людьми,
we are grown-up people, mature people, and there are those who are present here in this auditorium. Look back to the years when the relations between the USSR in those days and the US were even at a lower level than they are now. But we seem to be resorting more and more to the rhetoric of the Cold War times, and that echoes of a situation some 30 or 40 years ago. In the Russian political discourse, we more and more come across assessment that there was less misunderstanding but more dialogue. Today, the situation could better be described as no understanding and no dialogue. And the student exchange between the US and Russia is as necessary as never before. It should be intensified, and without doubt, my words could be seen as a truism if I said that it is for the young to define our future. But this is clearly related to today's situation, because it is the effort of the young people that may make this world better and safer. When I joined the Gorchakov Public Diplomacy Fund, I did not realize how important this work was. We, on our part, seem to be engaged in many international events, and I see that the younger generation is highly motivated, and speaking for the Gorchakov Fund, I should say that we will take every step necessary to foster and promote the bilateral dialogue between the students of Russia and those of the US. And I would also like to conclude by giving thanks to the conference organizers and to the American students who found it possible to arrive in Russia without any fear of coming across some drunken bears with balalaikas, and giving the Russian students an opportunity to speak with their peers coming from the US, but the US students will perhaps have a more clear picture of the realities of Russia. And let me thank once again all those who have already addressed you, and I would like to stress that the Gorchakov Fund would try what it can to give assistance to this kind of event. Thank you.
This is not just a series of welcoming remarks, this is actually a session, or a panel as it is called, on our program. So since we still have some time before we should close and break until the next plenary session, I would like to use this opportunity to allow you to raise questions if you have any. Maybe one or two. We have the time for one or two questions, I suppose. From the students, from the public. Any pre-written questions, maybe? Yeah.
Yulia Nikitna, Associate Professor. I have a question to the representatives of the diplomatic community. So thank you very much for your presentation. My question is more philosophical in a way, or linguistic probably. So both of you were talking in terms of the official discourse, using the terms which give an impression that actually the relations are really not that good. From your diplomatic experience, personal experience, what are the words, the terms that diplomats start using when the relations are becoming better? So what are the signs, markers of relations becoming better? Just personal experience, thank you.
Thank you. And there was one more question, yeah? Please. Shall we just take two questions?
That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, first of all, for your speeches.
Introduce yourself, please.
What?
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Maxim Orlov, and I represent Academic Mobility Center. Some of panelists knows me. Yeah. And my question is to all of you, but yeah, mainly to the representatives of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia. So last year I had an internship in Department of North America, and some representatives mentioned that if we do not have any cooperation with the United States on senior issues like security or someone else, there is no possibility for cooperation in civil society. So I'm a representative of a Russian NGO that is supported also by a Gorchakov Fund or others, financially, informationally, etc. So do you really believe that for today there is no any possibility to cooperate between Russia and the United States in civil society and organize any youth events like this Fletcher МГИМО event or others for youth to somehow improve our relations. Thank you.
I'll start then from the second question. Sure, this is not true that if our relations now, our intergovernmental relations are bad, we cannot deal with each other on NGOs level. Just vice versa, we support at the foreign ministry all contacts between different NGOs, Russian and American, and we believe that NGO channel is a good tool to strengthen the mutual understanding and mutual trust between our countries. So I would say that NGO channel and such conferences like yours, the interaction between universities, between academia, this is a very important channel, especially when we do have problems in our interstate relationship. And speaking about the words we use and what words we should use, we use all words as diplomats. We try to be polite. Sometimes we hold pretty harsh discussion between us in working conversations. But I'm sure that both of members of diplomatic service of Russia and of the United States believe that this is important to find a way to improve our relations and to normalize them because this is important not only for our countries, for our nations, but for the whole world. Russia and the United States are major nuclear nations, and it's clear that the climate of the international relations is really dependent on the climate of the relations between us. Thank you.
Thank you. The wait time is actually not quite as long as Georgi said it was. It's about 2/3 of that length. It's about 200 days now. And as Georgi knows, the reason why the wait time is so long is because the consular section staff over a year ago was reduced by more than 50%. So we have less people processing visas for Russian citizens. Now, as to ties between universities and NGOs, I mean, that's something that we share, our Russian colleagues' commitment to. There have been some difficulties from the perspective of American NGOs in cooperating with Russian NGOs, and the foreign agents law plays a role in those difficulties. In ties between universities, I mean, quite frankly, we have found that some Russian universities are certainly reluctant to deal with the United States government and, to some degree, reluctant to deal with American universities in the current political climate, which I think is unfortunate because I think these ties are immensely valuable and useful to both of our countries. As to the language, the first question about language and then when you can what are indications of an improvement in relations? I really don't have a good answer to that. Although I do know that when people describe a meeting as having been a frank exchange of opinion, that usually means that there wasn't much agreement.
Okay, thank you. One very brief question, maybe two. Very brief, okay.
Hello, my name is Nikita Andrianov. I am the first-year MA student here at МГИМО. And my question is, both countries are making some allegations that the other country did some things that infringes strategic stability. My question is to the diplomats. I want to ask, what do you really mean by strategic stability and how would you define it? Thank you.
Could you pass the microphone to a colleague down here?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear professors, and our honored guests. My name is Sergey Petrov, and I am a first-year master degree student. I have also very brief questions to Mr. Thomas Larry, and it is about unilateral accusations from the United States of America to our government regarding to missile 9M729, and I would like to ask you whether it is possible to build any kind of dialogue without basing it on equal basis, without compromises and without mutual consensus. Thank you very much.
All right, let me take the second question first. I mean, as to the Russian missile that we believe to be not in compliance with the INF Treaty, there has been dialogue. That was the point I made earlier. 30 meetings between Russian and American officials. You know, it's the United States government's position that this missile violates the INF Treaty. I mean, and I think dialogue has been taking place for over 6 years, but you know, as I indicated, our government indicated that if Russia did not come back into compliance with the INF Treaty, we would begin the process of withdrawing, and that is what has happened. Now, on the first question, how do you define strategic stability? That's a pretty tricky one. I can't remember the great American jurist who said this, but it's something he said. Yeah, who was it? Potter Stewart. Daniel knows where I'm going with this, but he said pornography is something that I can't really describe to you, but I know what it is when I see it. So I think I'll take the same approach to strategic stability.
That was good answer. And how do we see strategic stability? This is in our working language between diplomats and between military men. This is actually nuclear stability, stability of nuclear missiles, and this is the working language between Russian and American diplomats and military. And just referring to the second question about INF Treaty, I can stress once again that we did not get any proof from the United States about our alleged violation of this treaty. The only thing we got is the designator of this very missile, 9M729. That was a proof of our violation, but we never denied that we do have such missile with such designator. It really exists. It just flies not so far, just flies only 476 kilometers, not more than 500 kilometers, what is prohibited by the treaty. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions and your answers. And with this, we conclude. Join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. And just for your information, we're about to break for about 15 minutes. Please come back at 4:15 for a plenary session featuring really a stellar composition of wonderful speakers. And the students who are part of the module, please stay here for you. It's compulsory. For the rest, we would love really to see this full attendance here for the plenary session as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks for bailing me out there, Dan. I didn't have a clue as to.
that line many times, so
I didn't have a clue as to. Yes.
Как бы еще.
Well, they have their official roles. Yes, that's the president. But in some ways, it actually, do you know the word harbinger? Yeah. It's a harbinger for what I'm going to say anyway.
You know, I come here enough that it's work. I mean, I have to work. I can't go and have fun all the time. Tomorrow night.
Вы просто пытались сегодня это понять?
Ага.
Подожди, не заходи.
Спасибо, не нужно.
Уважаемые коллеги, пожалуйста, занимайте свои места. Мы начинаем.
Dear colleagues, please take your seats. We are starting our session.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrei Sushentsov, and I'm the director of the Institute of International Studies here at MGIMO. My great pleasure and privilege to greet you in our university at a conference on Russian-American relations. One of the students of mine, and I teach several courses here in this university, one of the students of mine have approached me during this short coffee break and asked me the following question, which puzzled me. And the question was this. So we heard an exchange between two diplomats, Russian and American. And if we take those exchanges in their true value, why do we actually have a conference on Russian-American relations? Do we actually have anything to discuss? And what actually they expect from us, a younger generation, if the length of the problem, the amount of the problem is such that they cannot figure out the next step? And why do they expect that we can do better? And this forced me to remember another instance of my interaction with my ex-student who is currently working with the foreign ministry, Russian foreign ministry. And our graduates are, I consider them to be pretty well trained in regional studies and in learning languages. And when he graduated from university, he was very optimistic about the perspective of Russian-American relations. He told me that he will put all of the efforts that he can to create a better shape for them. He expected and believed that they can be normalized, that they can be renovated in a sense that would give them a new value, a true value, a value of strategic partnership. And I met him 3 years ago after that. And this person was
telling me, thank you very much for the courses on American foreign policy that you were having in this establishment. But I can tell you that all of the problems in the Russian-American relations that we have because of the United States. So he basically came to a kind of a consensus in the diplomatic establishment that both countries share about one another. And this reinforces the observation that a first student who approached me during the coffee break made. And I think the current state of affairs in Russian-American relations is exceptional, possibly, and particular. And this exceptionality is highlighted by the discussion that is currently ongoing in Moscow, an academic discussion. What is actually happening in Russian-American relations? If I would describe this discussion in a very, like how we call it in Russian, широкими мазками, in a very raw sense, this discussion would include two camps. One camp believes that everything has been decided in Russian-American relations. We have complete certainty about what is going on. We have complete and perfect sense of what the trends are and where they will lead. And this is the future of confrontation. We are adversaries for the 21st century, and there is basically no way back. All bets have been made. Another camp is saying that there is much less certainty in the Russian-American relations that have been during the Cold War. We're not sure about the current trends. We see a lot of uncertainty. We see a lot of spontaneous events. We see that the impact of Russian-American relations on international relations generally is not that big as it had been throughout the Cold War. We see much more other active and able countries being involved in world processes and having an impact which they never had. And for these people, for this second camp, the ongoing state of affairs of Russian-American relations is a puzzle. They don't know where the things are going on. They are not sure that things have been settled. And I think this second camp makes the conferences like this important and valuable. We're still trying to brainstorm what is happening, why it's happening, and where it would eventually lead. And possibly the fourth question, would it actually be important 10 years from now, what is happening in Russian-American relations? And today I think we have one of the most able and, I would say, proliferate panel of thinkers and writers who would collectively brainstorm these questions. We have issues on our agenda that range from the theoretical and purely academic to the practical regional studies issue. And today I am joined by Chris Miller, who is an assistant professor in international history with the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tatiana Shekleina, who chairs Department of Applied International Political Analysis at МГИМО University here, Professor Daniel Dresner, who is a professor of international politics with the Fletcher, Fedor Wojtalowski, who directs Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Studies of Russian Academy of Sciences, Professor William Wolford of Dartmouth College, and Associate Professor Igor Istomin here with МГИМО. I would like to first address a question to Chris Miller, who recently published possibly one of the best books on Russian economy, and I would put him into a cohort of the rising Russia stars. The cohort is not big enough, but we still cherish that we have good newcomers into the field. Chris, your estimation, what kind of question, what kind of answer you would put in to this dilemma that both Russian camps in the discussion have? Are things certain and clear in Russian-American relations, and we're destined to one type of future, or things uncertain? And what your research would tell us to eliminate the answer to this question?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to all the organizers for setting up this very interesting couple of days we're about to have. You know, on the question of are we structured into a pretty negative relationship, or is there uncertainty? I think the answer is definitely there's uncertainty, and I reached that answer not based on any assessment of where we are today, but just by looking at the history of the past 200 or so years of American and Russian interactions, where in fact there have been very large swings. The best examples, I think, in 1941 and then in 1945, huge swings in how the United States and Russia got along with each other and then fell out of friendship after World War II. But those are, in fact, far from the only periods where there were quite sharp shifts in how the two countries perceived each other and the threat that the two countries at times see and at times don't see in each other's powers. So I guess when I look at the present day situation, it does seem like there's plenty of possibility of change, at least in the medium term. I don't think anyone's particularly optimistic about 2019 or 2020, but when you look over a medium-term time horizon, I certainly wouldn't presume that things will stay as they are now, if only because historically that's been a bad bet to make over an extended time horizon. And I think when I look back at the history of both U.S. foreign policy and Russian foreign policy, I see this question of perceptions changing rapidly being quite important. It was interesting, and I appreciated being at an event hosted by the Gorchakov Foundation. Gorchakov is, I think, one of the most interesting Russian foreign ministers in recent Russian history, and he wrote a very famous memorandum, which some of you might know, in 1864, explaining to the British Empire why it was that Russia was expanding into Central Asia, and the British were, of course, at the time in the 1860s expanding into Afghanistan, and the two countries were afraid they were going to meet somewhere in Central Asia and have a dangerous situation. And Gorchakov wrote a memo, which is now called the Gorchakov Memorandum in the Annals of Diplomatic History, to the British, saying that the most difficult part of running an empire is knowing when to stop. And you can imagine the British reading this memo in 1864 and saying, well, that's not an explanation for your foreign policy. But of course, when you look at British foreign policy from the Russian perspective, it looked the exact same. The British kept expanding northwards from India, and they never had a good explanation to Russia when they got closer and closer to Russia's borders in Central Asia. So I think that question of perception is quite interesting. And there you have a situation where both Russia and the UK were looking at each other, seeing the other as a threat, and seeing their own actions as defensive, even when their own actions were perceived on the other side as offensive. So it does strike me that that's a dynamic we have in great amounts today in the U.S.-Russia relationship. Both sides think that they're the one on the defensive and the other side is on the offensive. And the question, I think, is at what point and via what mechanisms can we begin to understand the other side's fears and also begin to find ways to mitigate them? And that's, I think, the point at which the relationship might begin to turn.
So uncertainty. I would count votes throughout this panel. Tatiana Alexeyevna, what would your take be on the same question? Are things certain and clear, or we're facing a period where things would still be fluid and change?
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I think for me a grand challenge is to restore any productive, constructive dialogue between the academic communities, diplomatic communities, and political communities, and civil society of Russia and the United States. Since I devoted all my life to the study of the United States, its foreign policy, and I have very deep and large-scale numerous contacts with civil society of the United States and non-government organizations, I must say that to me, not only to me, it's really a grand challenge. Because if we fulfill this grand challenge or meet it some way, and we are doing it here, and I'm very grateful that the Fletcher School and my colleagues from Fletcher School are doing this, trying to meet this real challenge. I don't like the word uncertainty. To me, everything is certain, quite certain. We are in the process of confrontation. I started to read historic publications on history, trying to understand what we lost, what happened, and how we repeat the mistakes that were made. And quite recently, I actually, on the weekend, I started to reread the book by John Geddes, The United States and the End of the Cold War. Implications, Reconsiderations, and Provocations. It was published in 1992. But I want to just to give several words written by him in 1987 that he repeated in this book. What did he write? But a consequence may be that for us, the Cold War has become a way of life. It has been around for so long that it is a thoroughly familiar, if unwelcome, presence. Few of us can remember with very much precision how it started. Fewer still take the time to consider what the world might look like without the Cold War. We have become so accustomed to this phenomenon, by now the dominant event in the lives of more than one generation of statesmen, that it simply does not occur to us to think about how it might end, or more to the point, how we would like it to end. So it was written 4 years before, 3 years before the end of the Cold War. But I think what he wrote is absolutely relevant to the present day. I don't have time to dwell on all the topics touched today. I think we'll continue this discussion in Boston. But what I would like to mention, maybe it is really so that it is a way of life so familiar to my American colleagues. Generations of them were actually studied the Soviet Union, the situation with the Cold War, and they have a lot of techniques to deal with the Cold War situation and the Cold War mode of behavior and life and relations with the, at that time, the Soviet Union, and this time with the Russian Federation. What gives me this very sad idea? At the end of the Cold War, at the end of the 80s, who remembers, who does remember any publication written by the Soviet scholars at the end of the 80s? And the Soviet scholars presented a very well-developed program of the end of the Cold War. There were very serious publications by the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, IMMO. We have here the director of this institute, Professor Vaitalovsky, member correspondent of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and by the Institute of the USA and Canada Studies, where I worked for a long time. Nobody, even in Russia, does remember these publications. And it was not just one-sided publication prepared by the Soviet scholars. We had a dialogue with the American scholars, very famous and very well-known scholars, who were interested in the peaceful end of the Cold War. So they worked together. Nobody does remember. So I want just us to remember something, maybe to come back to that time and to study history a little bit. My provocative assumption is that I don't want to repeat these accusations coming from both sides. They require certain discussion. But what we need maybe to take into account, ideology. The Soviet Union gave up the ideology in general, in international relations. The suggestion of the Soviet Union was to give up completely any ideological factor in the relations between the two countries and international relations in general. And we cannot say that the Soviet Union didn't give up this ideological factor. What happened to the United States? Did the United States give up its, as I define it, strategic ideology in general and its strategy of the reconstruction of the world? No, it didn't happen. I can say it with full responsibility because I have studied all the documents, strategic documents of the United States adopted, signed after 1991. So the paradigm of the American foreign policy is the same. And I wrote the article. The title is The Cold War as Part of the American Global Strategy. It may be debatable, but we need to take it into account whether both the United States and Russia simultaneously gave up this idea of confrontational relations. Do we think of anything else? I think we can. We can have some other relations. What disturbs me very much, I was in the United States for the first time in 1979. People came to the exhibit Soviet Women, and they came up to us and said, we didn't expect that you look like we look, that you are almost the same as we are. You wear the same clothes, you speak the same way, you're so educated. So they wanted to learn more about the Soviet Union and Soviet people. And as it turned out, they were very well, some of them, informed. And when now I come to the United States, first, I don't see much interest of Russia. There's a lot of stereotypes. And people really don't know how we look like, whether we are different from some awful image of the people wearing something like bears in the forest. You see, why did it happen? We have so many sources of information, and the knowledge is worse. It is also, to me, a big challenge, and I want to solve this problem together with my American colleagues. So maybe one of the, unfortunately, to me it's absolutely certain that we lost something on the way from the end of the Cold War to the present time. But there's no situation that is hopeless. There's always a way out. And I think that we should start maybe with be honest, at least to each other when we have discussions between themselves, and maybe to quietly to remember the historic facts from bilateral relations. And also, if the United States stressed so much attention, paid so much attention to non-government organizations, civil society, maybe we need to listen more attentively to different people in Russia, not only to opposition and to those who are not satisfied, but also to the people who live here, do not want to leave the country, and may tell you something interesting about their life. Quite recently, the Crimea was mentioned here, and the United States declare that they will not stop in their desire to bring Crimea back to Ukraine. But did anyone talk to Ukrainian people, not to opposition, but just to Ukrainian people? In our new book, we published the article written by the professor from the Sevastopol University. I know a lot. I spoke to people. I know how many people were really badly wounded who came from Kiev to Sevastopol without eyes, without arms, without feet. So people were really very much afraid of the situation. But nobody wants to know about that. So I think that the challenge that we have to bring back, to do away with the confrontational strategy, with the confrontational type of relations, just to listen more to the Russians who say some alternative views of the situation in the world, in Russia, in the United States, in the Russian-American relations. I think that the Fletcher School and MGIMO University are doing a really great job in trying to change the situation. And I'm glad that we have so many students here coming from the American university and from our university who will continue this great initiative. And as it was said here, the future belongs to you. You will be diplomats, political scientists, teachers, so you will, and I think nobody wants to deal with to live in the very unstable situation. I was also reading a lot in history. And to tell you frankly, when I ask the question, what is the main issue of world politics? What is the main issue of Russian-American relations? Who will answer? What is the main idea, the main issue? To me, at least, it is the issue of war and peace. And I think before we continue with the confrontational approach, we need maybe to think better about peace in the future. Otherwise, we will not survive and there will be nobody to solve all these beautiful problems that we declare in our beautiful presentations sometimes. Thank you very much.
Tatiana Alexeyevna is certain that the confrontation is the threat. And we have with us Professor Daniel Dresner, who once wrote a book that students at my courses know very well, Theory of International Politics and Zombies. The book uses this material to describe basic processes in international relations. And my students very much like this book. And even though it is not an obligatory reading for the course. And they questioned me, do we actually, so people 10 years ago were saying that the history has somehow, changed, possibly ended, we would not witness historical events, and what is going on in the 21st century is essentially either predictable or boring. What we face now is completely not boring, but it is fascinating, but also dangerous at some point. How would you approach the same dilemma about the uncertainty or certainty? Would you, or maybe you would develop your metaphor with zombies?
Thank you, Andrei. I'm not sure I can continue with zombies, but in terms of thinking about the future, actually, what I thought was telling was the exchange we had in the previous panel between the two official dignitaries, and the contrast between last year's conference, which was less than a year ago, it was in May, and now. The difference was that last year the two of them disagreed as well, but they were much more heated last year. Tom Leary got very vociferous in response to criticism, and the thing that struck me is that the metaphor I would use to describe the state of Russian-American relations right now is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. Kubler-Ross, talks about, what happens if you get an extremely negative news, and she talks about multiple stages. Stage one is denial. You act like it doesn't happen. Stage two is bargaining. You sort of try to figure out a way to deal with it. Stage three is depression, and then stage four is acceptance. And what I found disturbing about the panel before ours is that, the official dignitaries are now in the acceptance stage. If you listen to what they said, they were disagreeing with each other very violently, but they were very calm about it. They weren't worked up about it. They just sort of accepted that this appears to be the new normal. And so in some ways that's potentially depressing. And to be fair, from an international relations theory perspective, in terms of this question of certainty versus uncertainty, I'm a big fan of what is called within the IR world in the United States analytic eclecticism. This idea that if you're trying to focus on a specific issue, you can try to attack it from multiple theoretical perspectives. And if the multiple theoretical perspectives all tell you the same thing, well, then you're probably, that's where you're going. And unfortunately, regardless of which theory you look at, there's not a lot of optimism with respect to the immediate future of the Russian-American relationship. On realism, and I will obviously defer to Professor Wolfert when we get to him as well, but the only explanation you would have in realpolitik for a more Russian-American cooperation is a common external enemy. And the common external enemy, the only one, is China. And from a realist perspective, you can argue that Russia has clearly made its bet there, which is to say between China and the United States, it's betting on China. Now, you can question whether that's the right move for Russia to make or so on and so forth, but there are very grounded, realist reasons for why Russia would choose to ally much more closely with China as opposed to the United States. If you adopted a liberal approach, there's no denying that there's the opportunity for a variety of win-win arrangements. So that's the one more optimistic possible area where you could see there was cooperation. Although even there, you know, the areas of cooperation are in places like arms control or non-proliferation or trade or counterterrorism. And I don't deny that these aren't important issues, but it's a thinner gruel than, let's say, even Sino-American cooperation, or for that matter, Russian-Chinese cooperation. There's just not quite as much there. If you look at constructivism, you know, constructivism is all about the creation of intersubjective understandings, or, you know, in some ways what your rector, Rector Tukunov, refers to as strategic empathy. I think in some ways is the same thing. And this is where I don't think there's any way, in some ways constructivism is actually the best story you can tell about about what's happened to the Russian-American relationship, because it's not, we're now at the point where it's not just the interests are diverging, the very definition of what facts are diverging. You know, and I think, again, we heard that in the earlier panel. You know, and the only thing now that you can argue that both Russian and American officials have in common is a shared sense of grievance. Which is to say that, you know, on the Russian side, you can list a whole array of American, you know, perfidies ranging from, you know, NATO expansion to the withdrawal from the INF treaty to, you know, failure to follow through on cooperation and so on and so forth. And from the U.S. perspective, I don't even need to list these sorts of accusations. But the point is they've hardened. They haven't gotten softer, they've gotten harder. And so this is a question where I think before you can have any substantive area of cooperation, you're going to actually have to promote some degree of intersubjective understanding, and I'm not optimistic about that. Then if you turn to domestic politics, any kind of pluralist story, you know, in the sense there was a title here, you know, I literally wrote, oh dear God, no. The domestic politics on both sides are not in any way supportive of cooperation. In the United States, 2016 is still obviously a thing. The lack of economic interdependence also essentially eviscerates any kind of interest group that significantly, that gets any sort of concentrated benefit from improved cooperation with Russia. And I would add that the foreign policy community is not necessarily predisposed towards, they don't necessarily want outright hostility, but, you know, there's probably consensus within most of the American foreign policy community about having a firm posture towards Russia, let's say. And I would argue on the Russian side, at the risk of talking about Russian domestic politics, I think the end of the Crimean consensus here is also a problem, because it puts President Putin in a slightly weaker position than he was previously, which potentially makes it harder for him to make the concessions that he would potentially need to make for any kind of, you know, mutual cooperation from the Russian side. And then if you go to the level of individual leader or individual leader psychology, that's even worse than domestic politics. You know, if you look at, you know, Donald Trump, how would I put this? I dare anyone in this audience to name one example of Donald Trump saying he was going to cooperate with someone, anyone, and then following through on it. You know, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to actually follow through on it. And so the degree of sort of trust is potentially problematic. And similarly on the Russian side, again, at the risk of commenting on President Putin, you know, he has what you would safely describe as a zero-sum approach towards the West in general, and the United States in particular. And you can argue that, interestingly enough, the very fact that President Trump promised a whole degree of cooperation and nothing has actually followed through on that would in some ways calcify Putin's belief in the deep state in the United States. The notion that it's impossible to cooperate with the United States because these deep institutional structures aren't somehow permitting Trump. I'm not saying that's true, mind you, but I'm saying that within individual psychology that doesn't work. So is there any hope for the future? There's a little bit. You know, I don't want to be entirely pessimistic, so I'll end with a few notes of hope. First, it should always be noted historically, and again, I will defer to Professor Miller here, but even during times of sort of extremely tense, you know, conflict between the two countries, there's nonetheless been cooperation. You know, during the peak of the Cold War, you still saw cooperation on arms control. You still saw cooperation on the environment in the form of the Antarctic Treaty. You know, and there, you know, even now there's still potentially opportunities for cooperation. And also in terms of public opinion, we sponsored a poll that was jointly done with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and the Levada Institute here. And there was one area where both Russians and Americans strongly supported mutual cooperation, and that was in the area of arms control. So if leaders on both sides listen to their publics, there should be some support for arms control here. I think, I think there are three things that, I would recommend going forward. The first is, and again, this is self-serving, but we do need deeper institutional engagement between both sides. The idea that cooperation will be a top-down, just from Trump and Putin and then, spreading down, is an illusion. That's not going to happen. Instead, what you need is cooperation among parliaments, among different agencies, and track two, diplomacy. And I think this, in some ways, this conference is certainly one area of that. Second, I think we need to acknowledge reality, which is to say that conditions are not going to improve in the near term. Vladimir Putin's going to be president until 2024. Donald Trump might be president until 2024. And the United States, it should be acknowledged, has certain foreign policy, what would be the word I would use, divisions that are going to make it hard for progress to continue going forward in those ways. I think really, in some ways, what you can ask for in the present tense is a holding action. And I think in some ways, approaching foreign policy, you want to take some version of the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm, as opposed to promising that you can get better. But I would close with one last notion, which is it is possible to be optimistic for two reasons. First, again, I know this sounds cliched, but seeing the students interact actually matters, because I'm old. I'm really, really old. And so one of the problems with age is that you get to be more cynical as you get older, because you feel like you've seen things over and over again. You've seen history recur. And there are times where not knowing that much about history can actually be a good thing, because you can actually have the confidence to be bolder. Not to deny that you students don't understand anything about history. I don't mean to imply that, but that you might, your optimism has not necessarily been tempered. And I'll close with one mild counter to Professor Shaklena, which is she quoted Professor Gaddis repeatedly, which is always a good thing to do in a talk. It's worth remembering that the article that John Lewis Gaddis wrote that I remember most strongly is one about the state of international relations theory in terms of predicting the end of the Cold War. And so all the things I just said that predict that tensions aren't going to improve at any time in the future, it's worth noting that Gaddis pointed out that all these theories, again, during the 80s, did not predict an end to the Cold War either, and certainly not that the Cold War would end the way it did, which was relatively peacefully. So, I am very willing to be pleasantly surprised. And as you said, the question about we certainly live in interesting times, and my motto for the future is for the United States is, if Donald Trump says make America great again, my motto is make America boring again. I would very much like that. And I'll close on that. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Professor Dresner was actually sounding like, very classical Russian Dostoevsky type optimist. Dostoevsky type optimist, that is irony. Why is that? Because basically conflict is normal, life is imperfect, all of us will die, that is in our concept. And since the conflict is inevitable, but we have nuclear weapons, we are fine, because eventually we will get the Cuban Missile Crisis too, would get to our senses, everybody would step back, and basically things sticks. Short advertisement, since we're speaking to the group of students, MGIMO University has a master program on weapons of mass destruction and non-proliferation. So if the public opinion poll are actually saying that in this environment, public opinion in both countries value cooperation on these issues, people in that master program would always have a job. We have with us Dr. Fyodor Voitolovsky, who heads Primakov Institute of International Relations and World Economy. And major research of Dr. Voitolovsky was devoted to ideology in NATO, in the West in general. And even though in his capacity as a director, as I understand, he have zero time for research, and specifically for the research that requires a lot of time. I would still ask him to try to brainstorm an idea. Can we actually, no pressure, absolutely. Can we actually get ideology out of either, well, I would not speak about international relations, but let's say Russian-American relations. You know, there are positive things in the idea that the relationship are very bad, because we don't have any false expectations about one another. We don't see opportunity in one another. We don't see, you know, a better future in one another. We don't see each other as a solution to our problem. And maybe that is, you know, a Dostoevsky type foundation of pragmatic relations between one another. What do you think?
Thank you very much, Dr. Sushentsov. Thank you for such absolutely provocative presentation. And since I have been presented here as a bureaucrat, I will speak as a cynical bureaucrat, not as a scientist. First of all, I'm very glad to be here again at this conference. I have been here last time, and I'm very glad to see my friends from Tufts University, where I have been several times also. Concerning the uncertainty, I would like to start with your first question, which you have posed as a critical question, as a key issue for the whole panel. You know, it depends on the time horizon. Like a bureaucrat, I'm trying to define different time horizons if we're talking about the state of relations, the future of relations. If we're talking about short-term perspective, which I define as perspective till the beginning of 2021, when we will have the new U.S. president or the same new U.S. president, we can only think that a relation will get worse or be the same. So if they be the same kind of negative perspective, it's an optimistic view. If they get worse, and I'm pessimist in this sense, I think they will get worse, we will even see more dangerous in terms of international security situation. But if we're talking about long-term perspective, which I can define as a 8-10 years perspective, and at MGIMO we're working a lot on forecasting, and we're writing a lot about the strategic perspective of development of international system, foreign policy of major powers, international security. I think that we will get into more complicated, more interdependent and more competitive environment in which relations between the United States and Russia will be not so simple as they look like now. And we shouldn't, you know, draw the perspective from current political narrative, which is, you know, highly dependent on domestic political situation, especially in the United States, towards this long-term perspective, which will be more and more, you know, less predictable for both countries. In this sense, I think that your second question concerning the ideology lies more in the sphere of strategic thinking on the both sides. And contrary to the situation during the Cold War, I see that both sides are not having strategic perspective or just starting to develop the new strategic perspective on the global environment, international relations, and the international security environment for a long-term perspective. To make America great again is a great motto, but it's not the strategic perspective and not the comprehensive overview of the system of international relations and position of the United States in its system. But what is, I think, obvious to many experts, both here in Russia and in the United States, that the United States are entering into the period of their development where they would be forced to change the model of leadership, the model of relations with allies, the model of relations with partners. And in this new environment, they should develop more competitive strategy aimed to adaptation to the international system, which will really be more polycentric and more complicated in terms of its structure and hierarchy. What does it mean? Now, if we look attentively to the economic perspective, we will see that new centers of world economy are developing, but at the same time, these new centers are very interdependent with old centers, old markets. But this is interdependent, in which both sides are dependent on each other. It means that foreign direct investments coming from the United States to China and Chinese foreign direct investments coming to the United States, or together with mutual trade, together with financial resources working on stock exchange markets on each other, are changing not only economies, but changing social and political realities of on both sides, making them more complicated and forcing and stimulating development of the new groups of interests. If we will look attentively to Russian-American relations, we will see, yes, of course, and I here agree with Tatiana Alexeyevna Shakleina, who has marked a very interesting feature of this relationship, that Cold War has become, during the Cold War, it has become way of life of many people, and it has become, way of making careers, way of, receiving benefits in terms of financial benefits, political benefits, and others. Now we can see the same in Russian-American relations, and a lot of people are gaining benefits from current state of Russian-American relations and current state of conflict. Well, I think it's happening on both sides. People are making their careers. People are, and groups of interests are, receiving their benefits from it. But what I see as much more, significant for a long-term perspective is the factor how relations between not only Russia and the United States, but between the United States and China, between the United States and India, between the United States and other actors will change this landscape of groups of interests, how developments in US-China relations in the military political sphere will change these groups of interests, what's new will happen, how many people will make career on this. About 5 years ago, my friend who is teaching in one of military schools at the United States told me that he has only 2 students learning Russian. And about 40 people learning Chinese. I think that after the Ukrainian crisis and during the current crisis in Russian-American relations, I think 5-10 people more added studying Russian. But I think that 10 or 15 more added who is studying Chinese. The fact that China right now is having military budget 3 times bigger according to official figures and according to unofficial estimates, for example, of Stockholm Institute of Peace Research, 4 times bigger than Russia. It's bringing you the absolutely different perspective in terms of not only military spendings, but in terms of the logic of military political planning. The world is entering into the new phase of competition, not only in the sphere of private enterprise markets, but it is entering into the new period of competition in the military political sphere based on the revolution happening, technological revolution happening in this field. And I would like to emphasize that not only Russia and the United States, but also other players, including not only China, but India and some others, are investing a lot into development of military potential, and especially into perspective systems such as high-precision weapons, hypersonics, missile technologies, and some other things, including surveillance and tracking systems and cyber warfare means and space systems, which will dramatically change the media, the resources, the instruments of projection of military power. And I think that these developments will very significantly change the security landscape in different regions. If we will take into account that practices of hybrid warfare, practices of usage of indirect military conflicts and indirect usage of military force and privatization of usage of military force from nation states to private enterprise are dramatically changing the international security environment. We will get into a very, very competitive and much more complicated security environment also. And I'm not sure that Russia and the United States will be the major threats for each other in this sense. And I would like to also emphasize that we are also entering into the period when arms control systems and arms control principles are eclipsing. And at the same time, competition not only in the military sphere, not only in power projection instruments like Navy, aviation system, but also in the sphere of strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons is also taking a new start. And with collapse of the INF Treaty, it can be also stimulated by new practices of international competition, in which I'm not sure that Russia and the United States will play the principal role. So this is my view of uncertainty. I'm sorry it took too much time, but I hope that ideological factors and the role of ideology to be the most complicated issue in our relations. But I'm afraid that these issues will be much easier than others.
Oh, thank you. I think the first takeover from your talk for the students here should be that not only conflict is good for learning languages, but also that uncertainty is basically founded in the perception that peace is abundant, that we have a lot of peace, that we can permit ourselves to ruin regimes that have been structural for a Cold War, that we don't believe in a new Cold War. We don't believe this new world to be similar to the Cold War. And since we can permit ourselves to experiment with such strategically important issues, we don't believe in a new war. And here we have with us on the panel Professor Bill Wolford, who's one of the major pieces and articles, Stability of a Unipolar World, have been discussing the notion opposite to what Professor Wojtałowski have been discussing. No uncertainty, stability of a unipolar world, now and forever. And I know, Bill, that you have been attacked for this idea in any conferences in Russia, but possibly not only in Russia. And your insight about both issues, uncertainty or certainty, and availability of peace? Is it abundant, or we're facing a scarcity of peace, and possibly a new crisis would emerge somewhere soon, new Cuban Missile Crisis or something like that? That would show that no, it's not an uncertainty, it's certainty, and we have a new Cold War. What's it?
Well, thank you for that scary introduction. And if I can continue on the theme of language, I just want to observe with great appreciation that I'm sitting in a hall where I believe at least half of you, if not more, are native speakers of Russian, and yet almost no one is wearing the headphones. And having studied your language for 7 or 8 years, I can't even remember, with, as you can see, the great effects that I'm speaking to you in English, I just want to express my appreciation for all of your command of my language. I wish I could reciprocate. The subject, and also, of course, having said that, appreciation to you all. I also want to appreciate the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It's very pleasant to be here, especially pleasant to be on the panel with Tatiana Shaklina, a scholar of great renown, whose work I've been following for a long time. And I don't think Daniel Dresner gets the right to say that he's old. I think I get the right to say that I'm old. So at any rate, I want to answer the question, which is to do with certainty, uncertainty, unipolarity, and all these sorts of things. I guess I would put it this way. I want to keep these comments short in order to have a good question and answer. I think I can say the following. I am certain about some things and uncertain about others, and they mainly relate to the grand strategies, the fundamental foreign policy approaches of Russia and the United States. I'm certain that if there is no change in these grand strategies, we cannot expect an improvement, a significant improvement in the relations between these two countries. Really, since the United States became a global power, as a consequence of World War II, the two sides have always had incompatible grand strategies, with American grand strategy being based on the idea of preventing any state from maintaining a dominant position in Eurasia, and Russia definitely having a grand strategy which would seek to have an external great power like the United States not involved in the security affairs of Eurasia, or at least not in a significant way. Since the end of the Cold War, the grand strategies have not been compatible. The only reason we got cooperation in the 1990s was because the United States essentially could dictate its view to the Russians, that they didn't have much of a way to respond. Although if you look at the documents, you can see that the grand strategy fundamental principles stayed the same. Certainly since 2007 Munich conference of Vladimir Putin, and every document that's been produced by the Russian authorities regarding their grand strategies essentially stipulate that it is in the national interest of Russia for the United States to have a considerably smaller role in the world. They think it's both in the interest of Russia. They also think that that's where the world is going. So if you are asking why relations with the United States aren't so good, you could say if your premise of the relationship is that you really want the United States to have a smaller role in the world, what do you expect? Unless you expect the U.S. itself to want a smaller role in the world. In that case, of course, the United States would be a rather unusual great power. They usually don't like to have a smaller role in the world. But it could be that the United States will change its grand strategy such that it feels like it's in its interest to pull back away and allow certainly the European security architecture to take place without any substantial United States involvement, which of course has been the preference of Soviet foreign policy and Russian foreign policy since the very beginning of the Cold War, and has never changed. So I'm certain that as long as these grand strategies stay in place, we'll have bad relations. They've been in place more or less since 1945, and let's face it, relations since 1945 have not been very good, although there have been periods where we've cooperated more than others. What I am uncertain about is two other things. I'm uncertain about how stable these grand strategies are. I am uncertain about how fixed they are. People seem to think they're completely fixed. I'm not so sure. Certainly in the case of the United States, there's a lot of talk about movement in this grand strategy to a less ambitious view of its own role in the world. I doubt you will see real retrenchment. of the type some of my colleagues in the Academy favor, but I think it's surely possible. You can see the United States moving to a less aggressive stance in international politics, a stance more status quo oriented, a stance that is less insistent on spreading its principles and ideas into new places, a stance that is more compatible with a live and let live equilibrium with powers that do not have similar ideologies or domestic political systems. That's a possibility. It's much more likely than a true retrenchment and pulling back from Eurasia. Regarding Russia, it's hard to feel out exactly how much impetus there is for change, but I think we just heard a statement to the effect that the world is changing a great deal. There are pressures on this grand strategy. It's possible that there's a vision of the future that is compatible with Russia's interest that is not necessarily seeking as great a diminution in American role as the documents would suggest. And that brings me to my third area, my second area of uncertainty, which is I'm uncertain about what a possible bargain might look like. I'm uncertain about what a stable equilibrium could look like. And I'm mainly uncertain, I'm uncertain about the United States itself, in part because of these domestic political reasons. We really don't know how far change can go. I'm also uncertain about what Russia would be happy with, because it's never been given a chance to have a test of how it would respond to a different American approach to the world, since the American approach to the world has, and I agree with Tatiana completely, it's been relatively stable. What we don't know is how Russia might respond if the U.S. were to back away to some degree in insisting on the principle that its world order, its liberal order as it's called, could expand at any time in any place at the discretion of U.S. policymakers or local actors. I mean, if it were to move to a more status quo stance, not necessarily pulling itself out, but credibly committing no longer to expand, would that create the atmosphere in which potentially the Russian government could feel that its national interests were adequately secured in that world? I don't know that because it hasn't been tested. If I were running American foreign policy, I would try to test it. I don't know if it would work. Could be that we would do this, or they would just say, that's not enough. You have to go completely back to the American Western Hemisphere. We don't want you anywhere around. But who knows? Let's possibly. I'm willing to give it a try. So I think, Andre, in answer to your question, there's sufficient uncertainty about both the degree to which these grand strategies will change, and also about what a feasible kind of stable or better equilibrium might look like, that I'm not entirely pessimistic about these possibilities. Let me just conclude, though, with a few basic principles for thinking about this issue of American foreign policy. I know you're getting, about U.S.-Russian relations. I know you're getting worried that I'll go on forever, but actually I just want to have two principles on the table, aside from this idea that we can't know for sure whether a stable equilibrium is possible if we don't test it. And I'm advocating, in the case of my own country, I think we should try to test it. I leave it to people who are citizens of the Russian Federation to make their own arguments to their own government, what it should do. But I have two final principles to think about as we think about these relations, principles that I hope we recognize as scholars. Of course, diplomats have to take and defend their government's positions. But as scholars, I think we can take these two basic principles. First is the basic fundamental principle, it takes two to tango. Namely, if you have bad relations, it's because of things that have been done and happened by both sides. This idea that somehow only one side is the agent, first of all, I think, and frequently my country shows up as the one who did everything wrong. I think that disrespects Russia's agency in the world, fails to recognize how important an actor it is, doesn't realize that you guys have a role to play in this too, and frankly, it's just not serious from an international relations standpoint to think somehow every bit of agency is all with Washington, the blob, the foreign policy community. Unfortunately, I have colleagues in the United States who call themselves realists who take that view, which is, of course, completely not a realist view. Realist views international relations as tragic. There's two sides are doing what they think is best, but it results in tragedy, not some sort of morality play in which everything is the fault of one side. The final thing, though, is that we should look towards small steps. The final principles. Look for the small steps to get our way out of this. And, of course, as an academic, I'm free to advocate any policy position. Doesn't have to be realistic. So I advocate the following small step. Let's get rid of this goddamn visa regime entirely. Let's just not have it. Who the hell needs it? All right, thank you very much.
Subscribe. Subscribe. I think we can adjourn on this and make this as a major recommendation.
We've reached the МГИМО consensus.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you mean that abolishing visa for Russians, right? Igor Istomin, who is also here with us on the panel, has suffered a lot about the visa and I think he can share his story. But I want to let him speak on the other thing besides that. First, Igor, we need your input on the dilemma that we have here. Are things certain and sparkling clear, as in Clockwork Orange, or things are very much uncertain and we don't know future direction? And second, can you maybe challenge a bit Bill in saying that, well, even though he secured his position by saying that he is uncertain about some things, but still, I think he is much more to uncertainty and uncertainty. I know that you share diametrально противоположную, contrary position on this. Please share it.
Andre, thank you so much. It's great pleasure to be on this panel and great honor to be on this brilliant panel. When Bill was finishing his talk, I was thinking that there is one particular point which is a bit challenging for me, especially if we talk as realists or from the realist perspective. When he was talking about United States credibly committing not to expand, I think this is an extremely difficult proposition that the great power, especially the great power with the record and magnitude of the United States, could convince other great powers that it's not actually expanding. And I think this is related to the example provided by Chris, right, about the 19th century, when it was very hard for the great power. Of course, if the United States agree to come back to their Western Hemisphere, establish Monroe Doctrine once again, then maybe. But if you say, let's kind of freeze where we are, the problem is that the friction on these freezes is already there, and it's very hard to do it in relations with Russia, and even more so in relations with China, I would believe. Having said that, I would struggling with the question that Andre was giving from the very beginning about uncertainty, and I have to say that it is very easy, in my perspective, for us as experts, as people with no actual responsibility for the things, to talk about that the world is uncertain and that everything is in the shadows and we cannot understand what's going on. I think that there are quite a number of important things when we cannot read off the conflict on uncertainty. So there is this, and I remember immediately E.H. Carr, who was already in the 1930s, was writing that he was criticizing the liberals at that point in time, who believed that the conflict is just misunderstanding, that it will just change our view, change our perspective. If we talk more to each other, then we'll get over our illusional problems. And I think that with what I agree with what Bill said, that the actual postures have conflict points, genuine conflict points, which will not go away if we just talk more to each other. My perspective also, if we look back in the 90s, in the early 90s in particular, and there is quite a nostalgia sometimes going on. People are saying, Paris Charter for the New Europe, this new beginnings in the late 1980s, this probability of having everything settled in the 90s. How we lost all that? How we gone from that? There was this famous German rock band, which is roaming around Russia still since that time, who wrote this song Winds of Change, and very popular in Russia. I'm not sure that it's still remembered in the United States, but in Russia it's still a rock hit. And the one explanation for me why there was this optimism is that there was a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty at this point in time, and both Russia and the United States retain this ambiguity about what the other side is thinking when it speaks about the new world order or the new Europe or the future. And once this fog of ambiguity disappeared, we found ourselves once again in the situation that we are finding ourselves, that we have genuine disagreements. And what the spirit of the 90s, this actually very problematic period for the current international relations created, it created a community of disillusioned. The community, it's very interesting, it was very interesting to listen to the current dignitaries and representatives of official ministries. It's much even more interesting to listen to previous dignitaries, to people who served previously in the official positions. Not only because they are now more open to speak freely about the matters and they are not constrained by the official position, but because they are at the core of this community of disillusion, and they all could say, you know, we invested so much in good relations, we invested so much in Russia, or we invested so much in the United States. You could actually hear it in representations of the Russian president quite often. We did this and that and this and that, and they betrayed us. And this is perspective on both sides. It is shared very often by people who are talking to the people in the government, who are advising the people in the government, and who are often very much still in the government. And so I think that this is a problematic thing, that we have genuine disagreements, and we have, at the core of the political elite, this sense of betrayal of each other. And then the third element to the dire situation in which we find ourselves, I think, is that on both sides, and I think Bill also approached this, but I will say it in less polite terms. Both of our sides believe that the other power is declining.
Yeah.
So Russia believes for certain that the American age is over and the United States is declining, becoming just another great power. So the same is in the United States, that Russia doesn't have population, doesn't have an economy to sustain its great power status that it retained for a long time. And the question is then, why bother bargaining with this power today if you could get a better deal tomorrow? You don't buy things on the eve of the Black Friday, right? So why bother with trying to improve relations if you believe that the other side is going weaker? And I think this is a very important mechanism which prevents the two sides from solving these disagreements. I want to say that the fact that we do have disagreements doesn't preclude that we need to have the same kind of confrontation that we have right now. The one reason is, and it was also mentioned, we have a lot to disagree with third countries. And to disagree better with the third countries and to disagree within each other, we sometimes need better relations that we have right now. And that's kind of one of the sources of positivism view for me, especially in relation to what Fyodor Wojtalowski said about the emergence of multipolarity and the more different players who are going in different directions. That is also means that we will have much more players to disagree with, and not only with each other. But so far, if we are not just have disagreements, but we believe that the other side is getting weaker, we don't have intention to bargain, and we don't have to concentrate on other problems with third parties, we need to concentrate with each other. So where it leaves us in terms of our strategic postures, I think that in relations between Russia and the United States, we are both viewing itself through somewhat similar strategies. We approach each other through somewhat similar strategies. And it's not just the strategies of countering each other. I would call it the strategies of attrition. And the United States believe that if Russia is a declining power, that pushing enough sanctions, putting enough on its plate, will make even harder for Russia to sustain its current course, and will make it to change its course. And very often this change is associated with the change in political leadership, right? So it believes that through economic pressure, Russia just doesn't have the money to sustain this course. And on the Russian side, I think there is the similar sense of attrition, not in terms that Russia believes that it could outspend the United States. I think we are all realists. But the belief that Russia is dominant in the balance of resolve. That it's not so much material capability, which realists would like to talk about, but it's much more an ideational capability that at some point in time, the United States or some of their allies, like European allies, will not be eager to sustain the cost of quarreling with Russia. And I think this leaves us in a deadlock where there is no impetus to change strategies. There is no impetus to go into some bargain to solve things. And the problem is that attrition means that you don't have urgency. You are waiting your time. You are biding your time. You don't think that change is necessary, and you are okay with waiting some time until the other side will fall. But the one important part of this argument is you need to continue to believe that the other side will fall eventually. And this also creates for me a kind of concern regarding our dialogue, because the logic of attrition is always not to cooperate where possible and to quarrel where necessary, but the reverse. It's to deter where possible and to cooperate only where it is inevitable. And I think there was a question previously about the role of NGOs and the role of civil society. And I think what we see throughout the last years in terms of scientific cooperation, in terms of academic cooperation, in terms of civil society cooperation, because of the visas, for example, only, we have less and less opportunities to do that directly because of this confrontation on the high level. And to leave on somewhat less pessimistic note, because I think I'm the most pessimistic person on this, I think that the one part, and it's also related to what Fedor said, the one part which I think we have the two things which makes me less pessimistic. First is that actually Russia and the United States have low interdependence. That we don't have extensive economic relations. We don't have extensive relations on the basic level. And very often in the academia, we look at the interdependence as some cure which will, make politics much easier. Well, I take an analogy from the personal relations. As you know, most of the murders are done by the relatives. Why? Because they are so interdependent and engaged with each other. So interdependence creates a lot of opportunity to cooperate, but no less opportunity to struggle with each other. And the fact that we have so short agenda to struggle and to disagree with each other is one part of my optimism. And the second part of my optimism is what I said, that at the end of the day, we also have other challenges, and I believe that other threats to security and to long-term interests of both states are more important than, sometimes more important than threats that we produce to each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. You now make us feel very safe and sound for the future, because we are not relatives and will not possibly be. But this makes me worry about such American military allies as Turkey or some other countries with a very mixed track record. Your idea of the истощение, the attrition strategy, a good idea, but to make this strategy happen, you need to be focused on one another and to prioritize the partner or the adversary in your planning. And this is a question for all of us. Are we actually so much focused on one another, or we have something else on the plate and this something else happens every week and this is a new thing? And this, if this is what is happening, then I have issues with this attrition thing. But as you know, Igor from St. Petersburg and people from St. Petersburg never share things which are correct.
We'll be able to argue.
We will argue, yes, right, thank you. So, the floor is open now to the questions, and I see a few questions, including from my students, and I ask my students not to use this as an opportunity to outlash on the people whose papers I assigned you in my courses. Let us start with that part. Please, we will collect several questions and we'll have at least 2 rounds of questions.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Adlan Margoyev. I'm a graduate of that dual degree program on WMD Nonproliferation and a program director at Peer Center. I have a short observation that will lay the ground for my question to both US and Russian panelists. I think that both before the end of the Cold War and afterwards, the Russian Federation and Russian elites have felt vulnerable to the United States and still remained open for a meaningful dialogue, which would mean equally addressing the concerns on both sides. Although during that time, the Russian diplomats and officials have long collected and repeated their grievances about the US foreign policy. While the same kind of process started in the United States mainly after 2008 and the war in Georgia, I think it is only in 2016 when the United States leadership felt that the very core of its identity, democracy, was compromised. My question to the US panelists is whether the transition from stage 1 to stage 4 on the scale of addressing the reality from denial to acceptance will take too long, and will the United States be ready for a meaningful dialogue with the Russian Federation, meaning taking into account the concerns of Russia? And my question to the Russian panelists is whether the Russian Federation will remain open to such dialogue for long. Thank you.
Thank you. We will collect one more question from this side.
Thank you once again for this, for those presentations, and I apologize beforehand for my voice. My name is Alexei. I'm from Institute for the United States and Canadian Studies, also known as the grant. A quick question. To your mind, what might be the achievable first step to the improving of US-Russian relations? Is it visas, like William mentioned? Is it the strategic stability talks? Is it like talks on common threats? Or maybe the work on prolongation of the New START Treaty? Thank you.
Thank you. And this side, please. Mike?
Hello, my name is JP Craven. I'm a graduate student at the Fletcher School. I had a question. Professor Stoneman mentioned the U.S. putting economic pressure on Russia, and I just wanted to get some responses on whether that strategy from a political game theory perspective is too superior to economic cooperation. You know, there's a lot of lack of economic integration that was talked about a little bit earlier on the left side of the panel. And I didn't know if there was a way to change that through foreign direct investment, or whether there are just too many barriers and that really doesn't make sense as a strategy moving forward.
Thank you.
Юлия Никитина, МГИМО. I would like to build on the 4 stages by Daniel Drezner, from denial to acceptance. It seems to me that we can, well, actually, I suggest that to introduce a 4-stage scheme of improving U.S.-Russia relations. So from fear, balance of fear, then to trust. All the diplomats talk about trust. The 3rd stage would be respect. We usually don't talk about respect. And finally, Professor Wolford said, asked the question, what Russia would be happy about? So the 4th stage would be happiness. And my question is about stage number 3. So what do you think might be important for the U.S. to start respecting Russia, not trusting, not fearing, but respecting? Do you think that ideologies might be important here? Like, if Russia had a credible, competitive ideology, do you think the U.S. would respect Russia more? If it's not ideology, what else can be developed at this stage for respect towards Russia? Thanks.
Thank you. And one more question. Then we'll have the 2nd round.
Thank you. My name is Pavel Konevsky. I'm professor of political science at Moscow University. And my question is addressed to those who is eager to answer it. Because I think it's very interesting that throughout today's discussion and both sessions, I heard mentions of China and India, but nobody mentioned Europe. And one of the key aspects of Russian-American relations is actually NATO, something that nobody mentioned as well. You know, it's been a huge debate on NATO and its role in Russian-American relationship, and NATO expansion to the east is probably one of the most quoted examples of why Russia-American relations went bad, especially from the Russian side. And there is something that you can call Eastern European dead end, because it was one of the fundamental transformations when center of decision-making in NATO transferred from West to Eastern Europe, or at least it became as much as important as traditional Western European countries. So my question is very short, but I think it's a very fundamental one. How do you deal with this Eastern European dead end that is the key to Russian-NATO relationship, and in this sense to Russian-American relations?
Thank you. So we have 5 questions here. Achievable first step in Russian-American relations, economic pressure on Russia, and the game theory. Yeah. Professor Nikitina, question about respect and ideology. Does Russia would fix it by developing its own ideology? And I will question on Eastern European dead end. Let us just go in basically any order. And if you have a question that you would like to respond, please do. Fyodor.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much, Andrew. I really appreciate all of these questions, but I had to choose, and I have chosen 2 of them. First of all, I will start from the end. I really liked Pavel Konevsky's question concerning NATO. I think that you know, what is critical for the United States in terms of their relations with allies, and we have seen it obviously during last Munich Security Conference, is how to at the same time fix this relationship, which now not in a good shape, to engage allies more deep into the military political planning and policy planning aimed to keep American leadership in this emerging new strategic environment, and to play this double role, very complicated role of double deterrence, which the United States are facing both in Europe with Russia and in Asia Pacific with China. And another question which Donald Trump has placed in a very brutal way during the NATO summit, and then it has been repeated by Mike Pence at the Munich Security Conference, how to force European allies to pay more for their security and to pay more for common military purposes in terms of military spendings. You know, the United States are continuing to make their military budget bigger and bigger year after year, and in the planned budget for 2020 we have seen that more than 40 billions of US dollars have added, but we cannot say about military budgets of major NATO allies. And in this sense, the role of Eastern Europe in confronting with Russia and being as they call themselves countries close to the front line is critical for the United States, but also critical for these newcomers to the NATO. And in case political developments after the collapse of the INF Treaty and military developments will go in the way putting us into deeper confrontation on the European theater, together with further developments of ballistic missile defense systems and deployment of forces and political harsh rhetorics, we will get into the major crisis in European security with engagement of many of European allies of the United States, and NATO is a common entity. But I do not think that it is in common interests of all EU and NATO members, including Eastern European members, who will not benefit as much as they suppose. And I also like very much question came from Alexei Stepanov about achievable steps. And he mentioned the talks, possible talks on the prolongation of the START Treaty. I think it's a technical step. Of course, it can bring, the atmosphere of dialogue and some confidence-building measures into our relations. But it's absolutely a technical step, because it can only allow us to have 5 years more if the treaty will be prolonged in before 2021, and we will have 5 years more till 2026. But it doesn't mean that we will have the new treaty taking into account domestic political aspects of Russian-American relations. But what other achievable steps can be done? It's a very significant question in terms of how situation on the regional theaters, including European theater, and especially on the European theater, will develop. So if the intermediate and short-range ground-based missile will be deployed in Europe by the United States with support of Eastern European allies and with possible support of the whole Atlantic Union, it's one thing. But if Russia will do the reciprocal steps, it will be much more complicated situation in terms of European security. And in this case, achievable steps can be much smaller than they can be seen from nowadays.
Thank you.
I'll try to answer some of the questions quickly, the first couple of ones. Is the U.S. prepared for cooperation? No, because the U.S. is frankly too self-absorbed right now to focus on cooperating with anyone else. If we're going to be blunt about this, the fact is the U.S. has too much division right now about what the proper approach is towards Russia. So even if there were significant overtures, I think on the Russian side, I'm very dubious that that the United States, particularly the current administration, would have its act together to actually be able to know what cooperation looked like. If there is going to be a first step, though, and here I agree with Fyodor, it would have to be START. That would be the most basic and also, frankly, the most vital area of cooperation. So in some ways, that'll be a nice litmus test to see whether this is any sort of cooperation going forward as possible. On the sanctions question, does it make sense from a game theory perspective as opposed to engagement? The answer is actually from a game theory perspective, yeah, it does make sense. Because the goal of the sanctions is not necessarily just to get Russia to acquiesce with respect to Crimea or Eastern Ukraine or so on and so forth. The goal is also deterrence, which is it might not be about Crimea or Eastern Ukraine. It might be about the rest of Ukraine, or it might be about other actors contemplating similar actions. And so in that sense, for that to work, you want to have sanctions rather than greater engagement because it creates what would otherwise be called the moral hazard problem. I'm not saying it'll work, mind you, but you asked what the game theoretic logic was. And to Yulia's question about respect, if it's possible, I also have my doubts here about whether or not it's possible, at least in the short term. One of the things I've been struck by just in these two panels was the complaints by some of the Russian participants that the United States doesn't talk as much about Russia as it used to. Again, if we're going to speak some blunt truths here, the United States is never going to talk about Russia to the same extent that it did during the Cold War. That's just a brute fact of life that has to be acknowledged. And unless that is acknowledged, then I think respect is going to be difficult, because then there will always be these complaints about this sort of thing. And so I think, let me put it this way, the stages of grief have to go forward on both sides, I think, for that to actually to have respect, I think, going forward.
Let me commend all 5 questions, which I were impressed were all somewhat forward-looking and optimistic after Dan Dresner's Dostoevsky optimism and Professor Stoneman's even more pessimistic presentation. So my appreciation of the search for optimism. Let me, if I can, pick up on Pavel's question about Europe and NATO, which I quite liked, both because in the United States and in Russia there's often people interpret NATO as simply a U.S. phenomenon. Certainly the U.S. current president is mostly interested in what does the U.S. get out of NATO, and I think in Russia you often have a similar simplification of how decisions in NATO are made. And I think Eastern Europe is actually the place where we ought to be focusing, because it's on the Eastern European border where the key confrontations are happening, Ukraine above all, and it's in Eastern Europe where people are bearing the brunt of the confrontation, again, in Ukraine above all. And it's also in Eastern Europe where the people are feeling the most insecure, where they were feeling relatively more secure a decade ago and certainly 2 or 3 decades ago. So I think you're right to focus on Eastern Europe. Now, the next question is, well, what does that mean to focus on Eastern Europe? Having just been in Kiev on Friday, I can tell you that there's, we're no more close to a solution there than we were a year ago or 4 years ago, sadly. But I think there has been a bit of undue pessimism about the Eastern European question, and both sides, I think, haven't fully realized that if there's no effort to make the other side feel more secure in Eastern Europe, there's going to be no solution. The interesting thing about the NATO debate, which I think you correctly emphasized, has shifted from the Western European decision makers towards Eastern Europe. And that's been driven in part by security concerns within NATO. And obviously, when you look at Russian military deployments on Russia's border with Europe, those two have been driven by security concerns. And so until those are addressed in some fashion, I think you're right that we shouldn't expect an improvement in relations, which I know doesn't answer how they should be addressed.
Thank you. Tatiana Alexeyevna.
There's not so much time, so I will not dwell on all the questions. But just following the remarks by Professor Dresner, I must say that Russia doesn't require more attention than it used to have during the Cold War. Russia does require not to interfere too much and not to block its efforts in Eurasian integration, in its foreign policy, in its domestic policy. So when the decline in Russian studies started in the United States, and it started already in the 90s, I was not very much upset. I said that when American scholars and politicians have real interest in learning Russia better and learning the Russian language, they will come back to it. So it is just the situation that will maybe will change someday. Speaking about the first step, I cannot speak for the politicians, but here we are all think tank people and professors of the leading universities. I think that the first step should be maybe, and I think I already see this first step here today, when we are open, honest, and we say plain things to each other. And not just repeat the official condemnations and official just lying, I would say, not only in the United States, just everywhere, especially in mass media. And maybe what we should do, we should invite journalists, mass media people to our discussion so that they could listen to us. And maybe we could ask them questions. Why do they lie so much? And why do they violate all morals, norms, and values that in Russia said the same? Do they have any moral orientations? Do they have any mercy for people, for their problems? I don't know. So it would be very interesting for me to talk to them, to have them with us, and to answer our questions, not only to ask questions. They always ask questions, but I would like to see them answering our questions. So I think we are already on the track. I mean, the Fletcher School and the MGIMO and all participants making the first step in changing the situation. I have been the specialist on think tanks in the United States in the Institute of the USA and Canada Studies. And so one of the tasks of the think tanks, as it was written by, for instance, James McGann, and I think he is one of the best specialists on think tanks, to give new ideas, to explain things, to give some new initiatives, to try to change the situation and to influence the politicians. So I think it's a very slow process. It was so easy to destroy everything, but it's very, it takes a lot of time to build something. And I think it's our task to go slowly, step by step, in constructing this new base for Russian-American cooperation and interaction. Speaking about ideology, it's a very special question. In recent American publications, the official American ideology is neoconservatism. It's a debatable question. We need to discuss it. But I read several books on that. What is the official ideology of Russia? I don't have a clear answer, but I think the Russian, maybe, ideology is great power ideology, active participation in world politics, and establishment of more favorable surroundings and conditions for successful Russian economic and all kinds of developments. And of course, Russia is steadily supporting the idea of avoiding any big war and conflict with Russian participation.
Thank you. Bill?
Well, we have to go fast out of respect for our audience. I would say that 3 of the questions, at least, actually can be unified to connect to the theme that Igor Istomin raised, namely the question of power relations, because respect, frankly, in international politics comes from estimates of power. Whether you want to take a first step towards a dialogue depends on whether you have the right bargaining range, and the right bargaining range depends on these power estimates. So Igor Istomin really hit the crucial issue, which is if either side thinks it can do better later, it's not going to talk. So the question is then that he didn't address was what changes these kinds of power assessments. My first book was on perceptions and assessments of power in the Cold War. I tried to understand how they were related to cooperation and conflict in the Cold War. And there's basically 2 sources of these changes. They can come from within the country. The country can have a crisis that causes it to re-estimate its power. That happened in the Soviet Union towards the end of the Cold War. Or it can happen because of a crisis between the 2 countries or with a third country. That can have either of 2 effects in turn. Namely, it can either cause a country to reassess its assessment of its power trajectory, saying, wow, I guess I'm not as strong as I thought, or I guess the other side is stronger than I thought. Or it can cause them to see some other issue as being more important than gaining advantage in the bargain. And this is happened in, we have good documentation of it, with several of the Cold War crises, but most notably the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll just end on the hope that it doesn't take another war-threatening crisis for us to change our assessments of our bargaining power or the relative importance of the bargain.
Igor.
Yeah, just quick also response to several questions. What could be the first step of relations? In my sense, if we talk about practical steps, it's not important which of them. Every strategic stability, Europe, ideology, everything could be the first step, and everything could be just one single shot aspect of cooperation, does not change in the overall dynamic. I think that what we try to talk in this panel also about some more deep-seated dynamics, and if they should be addressed, and then practical things could be very, very different each time. Although I have to remind you, I think it's on YouTube, during the last conference in May, I think Chris provided the whole roadmap how to improve Russian-American relations. And I'm still wondering why no one in the government has used it to change it.
My first answer was arms control.
Yeah, yeah. On the a very interesting question on kind of economic pressure, economic sanctions, economic cooperation, I think what I would like to add to what Dan said, I think there is in game theory, there is this notion of dominant strategy. So basically the strategy that beats any other strategy of the opponent. So when you play, if you have dominant strategy, you always play your dominant strategy. You do not adapt to the play of the other side. I think at some point there was a belief that economic interdependence is the dominant strategy, and that you need to engage everyone. And by engaging, I don't know, China, India, and everyone, Russia, so to say, you'll make them more susceptible to you politically. Now there is the belief in the United States that the dominant strategy is sanctions. And so what you do, you always do play your dominant strategy. It's very often that it is not that simple, and the game is much more complicated. What Yulia said about respect, I'm not sure that trust and respect should go in order. You first could respect the other side without trusting it. But I think that Bill said about his first book, I would remind about one of his last books about status. And this is where a lot of things about respect are going. So what are the status considerations of the powers, and what are the different types how you could signal respect? And it's not always easy to signal respect to the other side so it is satisfied. So I think it is kind of also to some extent in the eyes of the beholder. And finally, what Pavel asked and said about NATO, I think very useful for me to rebuttal what Andrei said after my presentation, because I think Europe is a perfect...
about St. Petersburg or what?
Well, about St. Petersburg, you are just plainly wrong, and I don't even want to comment that. But on the substantive side, I think what is happening now in Europe demonstrates how you could pursue the policy of attrition without being fully engaged and focused, because the United States are not focused on Europe at all. And at the same time, what they are doing in Europe is very much deterring Russia and trying to increase the cost for Russia in this region. So if you are the United States in particular, you do not necessarily need to be that precise focus, and you could even make it easy or enable the other players, the local players, much smaller players, frankly speaking, to run the show, something that Pavel was talking about.
Thank you, Igor. Well, if you're right, which is a rare occasion, we would see some Russian activity in Western Hemisphere. Russia is not focused on Western Hemisphere at all. But if that's an easy way to, put an attrition strategy on the United States, that should be the case. And to sum up this panel, I think we have actually concluded that Russian-American relations have normalized. There is no, mutual expectations, positive one. We don't see solution in one another. And we don't see Russian-American relations to, dramatically worsen. There would be some problematic issues, but, being Dostoevsky optimists, we know that that is temporary, and eventually life is much more complex than two of us can imagine. I'm not sure if it's a positive outcome or a negative outcome for the future of stability, but I would point out that observing and analyzing Russian-American relations in current time is a particularly interesting and challenging, including in theoretical sense, enterprise. Let us thank all of, I should confess that we don't have a time for a second round of questions, so I should
I should apologize.
I don't know how it's in English, so I should apologize for the people whom I said that there would be a second round of questions. We don't have it. No, Vice Rector writes me very fiercely on the telephone. Yeah. So let us thank the panel for the fascinating discussion, and thank you all for attending.